Hey everybody, this is chapter 3 of Dirk Braunstein's Adorno's Critique of Political Economy. Chapter 3 is titled Objection to the Intérieur and the Sociology of Interiority. It starts with a quote, "We shall work our way laboriously through wild hedges and thick underbrush, like the unfortunate suitors of the Sleeping Beauty, to find at last, end quote. E. Marlitt, Gold Elsie, or Elsie. Who knows? I could look it up, but, I'm trying to get through this thing. I feel guilty reading this because it's not precisely about what I have, what I specialize in. Or, sounds so douchey, but probably should be reading something about the USSR. But anyway, in 1927, Adorno submitted Der Begriff des Unbewussten in der transzendentalen Seelenlehre, the concept of the unconscious in the transcendental theory of mind, for consideration as a habilitation, the postdoctoral manuscript one must write in Germany to teach one's own academic research at the university level, and thus to pursue a career as a professor. Footnote: this work, which was never published by Adorno himself, can now be found in Volume 1 of the Gesammelte Schriften. I think that translates as the complete writing, so I would guess. End footnote. This is all for naught. The work was, quote, determined to be too insubstantial and withdrawn by Adorno, end quote. Interestingly, however, its, quote, concluding remarks, end quote, are already, quote, committed to Marxism, a Marxism, of course, which to some extent Adorno has not yet completely processed, end quote. Patazzi, 1983. Footnote: Adorno submitted this manuscript to Hans Cornelius, who previously had accepted his dissertation. It's probably Cornelius. Cornelius, the founder of a, quote, eminent philosophical approach of strict epistemology between Neo-Kantianism and phenomenology, end quote. Lang, 1995. Expresses a negative opinion of Adorno's work in an assessment written to the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Frankfurt, quote, I must therefore submit that Mr. Wiesengrund be advised to withdraw his application, as his work, in its present form at any rate, does not meet the necessary requirements, end quote. Quoted in Moser, 2003. End footnote. Compared with the, quote, framework of transcendental philosophical preconditions, end quote, Adorno had imposed upon himself and faithfully followed until then, these remarks constitute a fundamental break occurring, quote, immediately within the text, end quote, and facilitating a critique of ideology also present in Adorno's later works. Regarding the predominant theories of the unconscious at the time, Adorno assigns them an ideological function within the general sphere of the social and the particular sphere of the economic. Quote, these theories of the dominant mode of economics and of the supremacy of the economic in general primarily seek to distract when they attest that, in addition to economic forces, there are other equally potent forces which are independent of consciousness in every sense, and thus free from the economic tendency towards rationalization. That is, they seek to distract when they attest that islands remain to which the individual can retreat to escape economic competition. Such realities existing independently from the economic process of production are held to be nothing other than the unconscious powers of the mind, powers into which one only need retreat to find respite from economic coercion through contemplation or enjoyment, as if they were summer resorts for one's consciousness, end quote. Adorno. Adorno sees the theory of the unconscious as both having a sedative function and as being unable to account for the way in which this function is socially mediated. Rejecting this and anticipating later developments in critical theory, which would come to view, quote, scholarship as one force of production among others in society and is intertwined with relations of production, end quote. Adorno defines the general function of theory as, quote, always itself social, end quote, and therefore as, quote, based in social relations, end quote. Adorno. While Adorno's 1924 doctoral dissertation, quote, unreservedly adopts the version of transcendental idealism espoused by, bracket, his doctoral advisor, and bracket, Hans Cornelius, end quote, his would-be habilitation marks a final break with the conventions of transcendental philosophy. Footnote. Like der Begriff des Unbewussten in der transzendentalen Seelenlehre, Adorno's doctoral dissertation would remain unpublished during his lifetime. The fact that he never submitted either text for publication later in life was, quote, not accidental, not due to a lack of opportunity to do so, but rather because they appeared to Adorno to be lacking only shortly after their composition, end quote. Tiedemann, 2003. The dissertation is now located in Adorno's Gesammelte Schriften under the title Die Transzendenz des Dinglichen und Noematischen in Husserl's Phenomenologie. The transcendence of the material and the nomadic in Husserl's Phenomenology. End footnote. Adorno had become a proponent of a materialist critique of society and economy, albeit a critique which had yet to be articulated. After his first habilitation attempt, Adorno composed Kierkegaard, Construction of the Aesthetic, in 1929-30, and saw the manuscript accepted in 1931. Finding it to be a, quote, extremely interesting and most significant piece of work, end quote, Walter Benjamin claims in a letter to Adorno that it left him with the impression that, quote, there are still sentences which allow one individual to stand in for and represent another, end quote. Walter Benjamin. Footnote. Letter from Benjamin to Adorno, 1st of December 1932. And footnote. A laudatory review written later by Benjamin would prove strikingly prophetic. Quote, this book contains much in a small space. The author's subsequent writings may someday emerge from it. It is in any case one of those rare first books in which inspiration manifests itself in the guise of criticism. End quote. Benjamin. Benjamin's endorsement of this debut work is not entirely coincidental. Beyond its original Adornian ideas, Kierkegaard bears the lasting impression of Benjamin's own, The Origin of German Tragic Drama. Originally written as a habilitation and submitted unsuccessfully in 1925, quote, not least due to the anti-Semitism of the German university, end quote, to the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Frankfurt, where Adorno's own first habilitation attempt would also end in failure. The Origin of German Tragic Drama was published as a book in 1928. Quote, among Benjamin's completed works, probably the most substantial, end quote. The Origin of German Tragic Drama exerted an immense influence on Adorno in the 1930s. Footnote. Benjamin's book is mentioned explicitly at one point in Adorno's debut. Footnote. Tiedemann and Footnote. In contrast, Adorno writes to Horkheimer in 1937 that he still, quote, regards Benjamin's work on Goethe's elective affinities as Benjamin's best work, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 25th of January. End footnote. In a letter written after having read Adorno's book on Kierkegaard, Gershom Scholem describes it to Benjamin as, quote, a sublime plagiarism of your thought, end quote. Footnote, letter from Scholem to Benjamin, 24th of October, 1933. End footnote. Adorno would dedicate his first 2 semesters of teaching respectively to works by the 2 most important theorists for him at the time. In the summer semester of 1932, Adorno held a seminar on Benjamin's The Origin of German Tragic Drama, followed by a seminar in the winter semester on Lukas's The Theory of the Novel. As Susan Buckmorse notes regarding the theoretical background of Adorno's engagement with Kierkegaard, quote, Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel was the bourgeois alternative to that of Marx. Although both rejected Hegel's identity theory, because Hegel's identity theory lost sight of lived reality, Kierkegaard rested his case on the reality of individual existence, whereas for Marx existence was a social category. For Kierkegaard, the riddle of philosophy was ontological, the meaninglessness of human existence. End quote. Buckmorse, 1977. As an author's note in the New German Edition attests, Kierkegaard addresses a constantly prevalent motif in Adorno's later work, that of, quote, the critique of the domination of nature and of the reason which dominates nature, that of reconciliation with nature, and of the self-consciousness of spirit as an element of nature. End quote. Footnote. Romano Pacai argues that Adorno is already moving, quote, towards the horizon of dialectic of enlightenment, end quote, in Kierkegaard, the book, via the concept, quote, of a dialectic in the mythical foundation of nature itself, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. As an author's note in the New German Edition attests, Kierkegaard, the book, addresses a constantly prevalent motif in Adorno's later work, that of, quote, the critique of the domination of nature and of the reason which dominates nature, that of reconciliation with nature, and of the self-consciousness of spirit as an element of nature, end quote. Adorno. While the ideological critical element of the rejected habilitation only emerges at its very end, and in a quasi-underhanded manner as something external to be considered from the perspective of transcendental philosophy, a critique articulated in a Marxist vocabulary, or in what was at the time really a Lukashian vocabulary, occupies a central position in Kierkegaard, the book. From a socio-critical perspective, Adorno rejects Kierkegaard's ethics and their invocation of the Christian motif of neighborly love, arguing that to love thy neighbor is a meaningless notion, quote, when human relations are so performed by the domination of exchange value, the division and commodity form of labor, that one, quote, neighbor can no more respond spontaneously to the other for more than an instant than the individual's kindness suffices to do him any good, let alone have an effect on the social structure, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, through unfolding commodity relations, the social basis of the transcendentally grounded ethic of fraternity is destroyed, end quote. Schiller, 1993b. End footnote. For Adorno, Kierkegaard's Protestant ethic is merely liberal ideology in the guise of religion, an ideology which claims that the allegedly free subject, which is individually virtuous according to a higher order justice, is always rewarded in kind. Quote, The possibility that a person, faultless in terms of private ethics, could act infamously in his objective social function, a function not reducible to inwardness, is a thought that Kierkegaard does not allow to occur. In fact, neither this immediacy nor this immediacy's semblance exists in the framework of common class interests. The rupture of immediacy is identical with that between the classes. Kierkegaard's ethics of concrete, meaningful life is therefore a poor and deceptive class moral. End quote. Adorno. According to Adorno, rather than criticize the social conditions responsible for impoverished individuality, for the isolation of individuals, parenthesis, die Vereinslung der Einzelnen, in parenthesis, Kierkegaard seeks a solution to the problem of injustice between human beings within individuality itself. The, quote, universality of the moral law, end quote, proclaimed by Kierkegaard, a law whose, quote, universality, end quote, he immediately restricts to the bourgeoisie, has both its genesis and limits in his own unenlightened, quote, class consciousness, end quote. Kierkegaard produces his theory not arbitrarily, but as a representative of the interest of his class, interests which disguise themselves as the public interest. One need not desire to discover, as does Lorenz Jaeger, a, quote, praise of class struggle, end quote, in Kierkegaard, the book, to see that Adorno here makes capitalism on the whole responsible for, quote, the reification of social life, the alienation of the individual from a world that comes into focus as a mere commodity, end quote. Adorno. Following Lukács, the experience of being turned into a commodity is taken as a totalizing experience, quote, in a society dominated by exchange value, things are, quote, immediately, end quote, accessible to the person, end quote, no longer. Adorno. Thus, at the same time, every philosophy which assumes an individual in itself, or assumes within the individual a pure essence of subjectivity, unaffected by objective social reality, has become obsolete. Section 2. The historical figure of the commodity. In May 1931, after finally having qualified to work as a professor, Adorno delivered his Antrittsvorlesung, or inaugural lecture, a tradition for newly qualified professors in Germany, programmatically titled The Actuality of Philosophy. Adorno attempts within it, quote, a comparative critical consideration of contemporary philosophical schools of thought, such as idealism, neo-Kantianism, positivism, phenomenology, and Lebensphilosophy, end quote, in order to, quote, establish his own concept of philosophy as the science of interpretation, end quote. Adorno. End quote. Mother Doom. Footnote. Quote, the actuality of philosophy is also a response to Marx's poverty of philosophy, quote, which included the first systematic account of historical materialism. In the second part especially, it comprised a critique of philosophy as practiced by the Hegelian school, which Marx confronted with the sense of history which Hegel himself had possessed. Whereas Marx drew from the poverty of philosophy the conclusion that philosophy should be replaced by history, for Adorno held fast to philosophy in a changed historical situation. The, quote, poverty of philosophy, end quote, consisted, in the objective compulsion linking thought to the discursive sphere, from which, nevertheless, it must detach itself, if it is to become materialist in earnest, end quote. Editorial note by Tiedemann. End footnote. Here, to an even greater extent than in the Kierkegaard book, with explicit reference to both Lukács and materialism, the commodity form becomes the central element of social knowledge. Entirely following Benjamin, Adorno's lecture begins with a, quote, bold denial, end quote, which simultaneously implies a renunciation of Lukács. Quote, whoever chooses philosophy as a profession today must first reject the illusion that earlier philosophical enterprises began with, that the power of thought is sufficient to grasp the totality of the real. No justifying reason could rediscover itself in a reality whose order and form suppresses every claim to reason. Only polemically does reason present reason's self to the knower as total reality, while only in traces and in ruins is it prepared to hope that it will ever come across correct and just reality, end quote. Adorno. Against both Hegel's assumption of an absolute spirit and Lukács' assumption of a proletariat capable as history's subject object of grasping totality given the right conditions, Adorno maintains that what must be grasped does not even correspond to reason. Some footnotes here that I missed. Footnote, as Peter von Haselberg would later recall, quote, it was a real inaugural lecture, polemical against all the dominant philosophies, dialectics, materialism, even the commodity form itself came up by no doctrine whatsoever. Instead, apparently turning quite modest again, at the end there was the optimism that spirit, even if it does not yet grasp the entirety of the real, might still penetrate the real within the small, might shatter within the small the dimensions of the merely existing, end quote. Von Haselberg, end footnote. Footnote, quote, the inaugural lecture appears to be a not unoriginal exposition of Benjaminian nosology, end quote. Patazzi, 1983. End footnote. For Adorno, a philosophy that continues to view reality as rational, quote, only veils reality and eternalizes reality's present condition, end quote. Adorno. Hegel's verdict that, quote, what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. That, quote, what is rational is actual, and that what is actual is rational, end quote. In Adorno's words, an imperative justified with reason, quote, to capitulate before reality, end quote, is categorical and claims to be valid independently from all historical and social variables in order to permanently brand any critique of existing conditions as unreasonable. In contrast, Adorno regards the notion that history teleologically propels itself towards the realization of a reason contained within itself as foolish in light of irrational reality, quote, not by interpreting the historical process as an irresistible power pressing toward a messianic break with the present, end quote, as in history and class consciousness, quote, but by focusing on the breaks, the gaps within the present. Here was where Adorno saw the hope of a new future, but never its guarantee, end quote. Buckmores. Here Adorno is in complete agreement with Horkheimer's critique of the philosophy of history in the book Beginnings of the Bourgeois Philosophy of History, composed, quote, on the basis of lecture scripts, end quote, 1 year before Adorno's inaugural lecture, Horkheimer writes that history in itself, quote, has no reason, nor is it a, quote, essence in the usual sense. It is neither, quote, spirit, before which we must genuflect, nor, quote, power, but rather a comprehensible collection of events resulting from the social life processes of human beings, ... The pantheistic promotion of history to the status of an autonomous, unitary, substantial being is nothing other than dogmatic metaphysics, end quote. Horkheimer. Adorno adopts the epistemological assumption that one cannot grasp reality by identifying reality with spirit or with subject, but rather only by means of the material of society. The task of theory is to configure this material so that objectivity itself can speak. Benjamin's conception of philosophical contemplation as resembling mosaics, quote, both are made up of the distinct and disparate, and nothing could bear more powerful testimony to the transcendent force of the sacred image and the truth itself, end quote, is taken by Adorno as the starting point of a philosophy of interpretation. Quote, he who interprets by searching behind the phenomenal world for a world in itself, Welt an sich, which forms its foundation and support, acts mistakenly like someone who wants to find in the riddle the reflection of a being which lies behind it, a being mirrored in the riddle in which it is contained. Instead, the function of riddle solving is to light up the riddle gestalt, like lightning, and to negate it, aufzuheben, not to persist and imitate it. Authentic philosophical interpretation does not meet up with a fixed meaning which really lies behind the question, but lights it up suddenly and momentarily and consumes it at the same time. Just as riddle solving is constituted in that the singular and dispersed elements of the question are brought into various groupings long enough for them to close together in a figure out of which the solution springs forth, while the question disappears, so philosophy has to bring philosophy's elements, which philosophy receives from the sciences, into changing constellations, or to say it with less astrological and scientifically more current expression, into changing trial combinations, until they fall into a figure which can be read as an answer, while at the same time the question disappears, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, if true interpretation succeeds only through a juxtaposition of the smallest elements, then it no longer has a bracket stake and bracket in the great problems in the traditional sense, or only in the sense that it, bracket suppresses and bracket, within a concrete finding, the total question which that finding previously seemed to represent symbolically. Construction out of small and unintentional elements thus counts among the basic assumptions of philosophical interpretation. End quote. Adorno. Next, Adorno's conception of reality as unintentional leads Adorno to a materialism which clearly stems from Lukács. Quote, the task of philosophy is not to search for concealed and bracket existing and bracket intentions of reality, but to interpret unintentional reality, in that by the power of constructing figures or images, parenthesis, Bilder, and parenthesis, out of the isolated elements of reality, it negates, aufhebt, and parenthesis, aufhebt, and parenthesis, questions, the exact articulation of which is the task of science, ... Here one can discover what appears as such an astounding and strange affinity existing between interpretive philosophy and that type of thinking which most strongly rejects the conception of the intentional, the meaningful, the thinking of materialism. Interpretation of the unintentional through a juxtaposition of the analytically isolated elements, and illumination of the real by the power of such interpretation, is the program of every authentically materialist knowledge, a program to which the materialist procedure does all the more justice, the more it distances itself from every, quote, meaning, end quote, of its objects, unless it's related itself, and the less it relates itself to an implicit quasi-religious meaning. For long ago, interpretation divorced interpretation self from all questions of meaning, or in other words, the symbols of philosophy are decayed. If philosophy must learn to renounce the question of totality, then this implies that philosophy must learn to do it out the symbolic function, in which for a long time, at least in idealism, the particular appeared to represent the general. It must give up the great problems, the size of which once hoped to guarantee the totality, whereas today, between the wide meshes of big questions, interpretation slips away, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, in art, the smallest element determines the total, as incidentally also in philosophy, end quote. Adorno. Down to the linguistic detail, Adorno appropriates Benjamin's epistemological aspiration, quote, to discover in the analysis of the small individual moment the crystal of the total event, end quote. Benjamin. Footnote, as Adorno writes in Minima Moralia, quote, Benjamin's writings are an attempt in ever new ways to make philosophically fruitful what has not yet been foreclosed by great intentions. The task Benjamin bequeathed was not to abandon such an attempt to the estranging enigmas of thought alone, but to bring the intentions within the realm of concepts. The obligation to think at the same time dialectically and undialectically. End quote. Adorno. End footnote. This aspiration represents a break with the, quote, 19th century concept of system, end quote, which submits itself, quote, to a syncretism which weaves a spider's web between separate kinds of knowledge in an attempt to ensnare the truth, as if it were something which came flying in from outside, end quote. Benjamin. Adorno uses Benjamin's category of the riddle, Rätsel, or Rätsel, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, to expound upon his vision of a dialectic which transforms philosophical theory into an element of practice. Quote, I said that the riddle's answer was not the, quote, meaning, end quote, of the riddle in the sense that both could exist at the same time, bracket, or in the sense that, in bracket, the answer was contained within the riddle, and the riddle portrayed only its own appearance and continued the answer within itself as intention. Far more, the answer stands in strict antithesis to the riddle, needs to be constructed out of the riddle's elements, and destroys the riddle, which is not meaningful but meaningless, as soon as the answer is decisively given to it. The movement which, bracket, executes itself, in bracket, in this bracket game, in bracket, is executed in earnest by materialism. Earnestness means here that the answer does not remain mistakenly in the closed area of knowledge, but that, bracket, it is spread by praxis, end bracket. The interpretation of given reality and given reality's abolition are connected to each other, not of course in the sense that reality is negated by the concept, but that out of the construction of a configuration of reality, the demand for reality's real change always follows promptly. The bracket changing end bracket gesture of the bracket game of the riddle end bracket, not its mere resolution as such, provides the bracket archetype end bracket of resolutions to which materialist praxis alone has access. Materialism has named this relationship with a name that is philosophically certified: dialectic. Only dialectically, it seems to me, is philosophic interpretation possible. When Marx reproached the philosophers, saying that the philosophers had only variously interpreted the world, and contraposed to them that the point was to change the world, then the sentence receives its legitimacy not only out of political praxis, but also out of philosophic theory. Only in the annihilation of the question is the authenticity of philosophic interpretation first successfully proven, and mere thought by itself cannot accomplish this. Therefore, the annihilation of the question compels praxis. It is superfluous to separate out explicitly a conception of pragmatism in which theory and praxis entwine with each other as they do in the dialectic. End quote. Adorno. Flashback to 1915, as Sigmund Freud addresses an audience of listeners with the following, quote, "It is true that psychoanalysis cannot boast that psychoanalysis has never concerned itself with trivialities. On the contrary, the material for its observations is usually provided by the inconsiderable events which have been put aside by the other sciences as being too unimportant. The dregs, one might say, of the world of phenomenon. But are you not making a confusion in your criticism between the vastness of the problems and the conspicuousness of what points to them? Are there not very important things which can only reveal themselves under certain conditions and at certain times by quite feeble indications?" End quote. Freud. For Adorno, Freud's proclaimed turn to the dregs of the world of phenomena, quote, "has validity beyond the realm of psychoanalysis, just as the turning of progressive social philosophy to economics has validity not merely due to the empirical superiority of economics, but just as much because of the imminent requirements of philosophic interpretation itself." End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Adorno writes of turning to the, quote, "dregs of the world of phenomena," end quote, Obhub der Erscheinungswelt, in several places throughout Adorno's work, the first occurring as early as Der Begriff des Unbewussten in der transzendentalen Seelenlehre. Translator's note: this phrase has also been translated as, quote, "refuse of the physical world," end quote, quote, "refuse of the world of phenomenon," end quote, quote, "offal of the phenomenal world," end quote, and, quote, "dross of the phenomenal world," end quote. End footnote. Adorno designates the economy as a suitable place for the possibility of, quote, "authentically materialist knowledge," end quote, insofar as a figure can emerge within it which contains all, quote, "the elements of a social analysis," end quote. One, quote, "which certainly does not lie before us organically, but which must first be posited, the commodity structure," end quote. Adorno. Yet even if the figure of the commodity structure were to emerge, quote, "this would hardly solve the thing in itself problem, and even in the sense that somehow the social conditions might be revealed under which the thing in itself problem came into existence, as Lukács even thought the solution to be, for the truth content of a problem is in principle different from the historical and psychological conditions out of which it grows," end quote. For Adorno, Lukács' attempt, quote, "to collapse truth into class origin was ultimately untenable because genesis and truth value are unrelated," end quote. Martin J. Against this, Adorno maintains that it, quote, might be possible that from a sufficient construction of the commodity structure, the thing in itself problem absolutely disappeared, like a source of light. The historical figure of the commodity and of exchange value may free the form of a reality, the hidden meaning of which remained closed to investigation of the thing in itself problem, because there is no hidden meaning which could be redeemable from its one-time and first-time historical appearance. End quote. Footnote. Hermann Schweppenhauser observes that, quote, the construct of critical theory, ... is formed following the Kantian construct, end quote. Schweppenhauser. In the preface to the second edition of Critique of Pure Reason, Kant writes, quote, a new light broke upon the first person who demonstrated the isosceles triangle. For he found that what he had to do was not to trace what he saw in this figure, or even trace its mere concept and read off, as it were, from the properties of the figure, but rather that he had to produce the latter from what he himself thought into the object and presented, through construction, according to a priori concepts, and that in order to know something securely a priori, he had to ascribe to the thing nothing except what followed necessarily from what he himself had put into the thing in accordance with the thing's concept. End quote. Kant. End footnote. The, quote, historical images, end quote, with which Adorno is concerned, quote, do not lie organically ready in history, not showing, parenthesis, shall, in parenthesis, or intuition is required to become aware of them. They are not magically sent by the gods to be taken in and venerated. Rather, they must be produced by human beings and are legitimized in the last analysis alone by the fact that reality crystallizes about them in striking conclusiveness, parenthesis, evidence, and parenthesis. End quote. Adorno. As noted in the original translation, shall and evidence allude to the work of Edmund Husserl. In One Way Street, Benjamin defines the, quote, faculty of imagination, end quote, as, quote, the gift of interpolating into the infinitely small, of inventing for every intensity and extensiveness to contain its new compressed fullness, in short, of receiving each image as if it were that of the folded fan, end quote. Benjamin, One Way Street. End footnote. As an instrument for constructing those images which are supposed to, quote, dissolve and solve, end quote, the question of being, Adorno identifies a, quote, exact fantasy which abides strictly within the material world which sciences present to it, and reaches beyond them only in the smallest aspects of their arrangement, aspects granted which fantasy itself must originally generate. If the idea of philosophic interpretation, which I tried to develop for you, is valid, end quote, Adorno continues his lecture, quote, then it can be expressed as the demand to answer the question of a pre-given reality each time through a fantasy which rearranges the elements of the question without going beyond the circumference of the elements, the exactitude of which has its control in the disappearance of the question. End quote. Adorno. In a letter to Krakauer written a few weeks after his lecture, Adorno recounts the, quote, scandal, end quote, it caused among the listeners. By his account, he, quote, decided on the relatively programmatic form, which is not at all up my alley, for no other reason than that everyone kept wanting to hear in clear and concise words what my expectations of philosophy actually were. But when it came to the point, it wasn't to anybody's liking. Max Wertheimer had a convulsive fit of weeping from rage and excitement, bracket, Adorno's habilitation supervisor, Paul, and bracket, Tillich, was repelled by the form because of its definitive tone. Karl Mannheim cursed, and Horkheimer, together with Leo Löwenthal, who has metamorphosed completely into one of his swarm of sets, flies, and satellites, thought it not Marxist enough. You can have no idea of the wrath, the flood of hatred, opposition, and malice that the lecture brought down on me. It would be too tedious to go into individual details, but not a single stage was lacking. From, quote, salon philosophy, end quote, and baseless arguments to obtruseness and complete craziness, Leo found the whole thing, quote, inhuman. Leo is planning to qualify as a lecturer. None of this is at all surprising. I don't fit in. I have no wish to forge a, quote, science or, quote, worldview. I want something that is fundamentally different, something which is entirely incompatible with academic categories and embitters people who basically want to inquire into the meaning of existence in Aristotelian or Hegelian terms. This was clear to me from the outset, and I believed that on this occasion I really ought to say what I think, end quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Krakow, 29th of May, 1931. End footnote. New section. To speed up the completion. Benjamin's familiarity with the Marxian critique of political economy developed in a similar manner to Adorno's. Only after becoming acquainted with this critique in the form conveyed by Lukács did Benjamin turn to text by Marx himself. Footnote. Benjamin had already come into contact with an exoteric Marxism of practice through Asia Lassis, whom Benjamin describes as a, quote, Bolshevist Latvian woman from Riga who performs in the theater and directs, end quote. And, quote, one of the most splendid women I have ever met, end quote. Letter from Benjamin to Scholem, 7th of July, 1924. In an autobiography, Lassis described herself as a, quote, good soldier of the revolution, end quote. On the biographical and theoretical relationship between her and Benjamin, see Cowan, 1995, Tiedemann, Goethe, and Lonitz, 1991. End footnote. Just as was the case for Adorno, quote, it was the earlier writings of Lukács which made the strongest impression, end quote, on Benjamin. In the article, Bücher die lebendig geblieben sind, books which have remained alive, an article published in the literary weekly Die Literarische Welt 3 years after the appearance of History and Class Consciousness, Benjamin refers to the latter as, quote, the most cohesive philosophical work of Marxist literature, end quote. According to him, quote, its uniqueness rests on the certainty with which in the critical situation of philosophy it has perceived the critical situation of class struggle, and with which in the overdue concrete revolution it has perceived the absolute precondition, indeed the absolute consummation and final say of theoretical knowledge. The polemic which has been published against this work by the authorities of the Communist Party under Deberin's leadership confirms in its own way the work's import, end quote. Benjamin. In a polemic from 1924, Ibram Deborin accuses Lukács of pitting Marx against Engels in order to revert to an idealist, quote, deviationist position, quote, in full agreement with the bourgeois critics of Marxism, end quote. Deborin. Quote, any even modestly trained Marxist will upon some reflection easily recognize the idealist tendencies which arise to the surface in a sea of muddled phrases, end quote. de Boeren. As Lukács would later note, quote, the official critics of the time, de Boeren, bracket Laszlo, and bracket Rudas, etc., erroneously criticized erroneous statements in the book, and thus also directed, quote, the fire of criticism, end quote, at those traits that were, unconsciously, of a progressive and forward-looking tendency, end quote. Lukács quoted in Fekete and Kolossi, 1981, the custom of discrediting Lukács as a revisionist or falsifier of Engels' theoretical role lasted throughout Marxism-Leninism. As late as 1971, the East Berlin philosophy journal Deutsche Zeitschrift für Philosophie accused him, Lukács, of, quote, falsifying representation of Marxist dialectics, end quote, claiming that Adorno's conception of Lukács's writings had led him to view, quote, dialectics as virtually the natural law of a still unconscious society, end quote, instead of as a transhistorical and positive materialist principle. End footnote. Benjamin's reception of history and class consciousness appears to have occurred somewhat gradually, however. Although Benjamin writes in June 1924 a letter to Gershom Scholem that, quote, the book itself is very important, especially for me, end quote, Benjamin had still only read Ernst Bloch's review of it by the following September. Quote, by the way, writes Scholem again, quote, I want to study Lukács's book as soon as possible, and I would be surprised if the foundations of my nihilism were not to manifest themselves against communism in an antagonistic confrontation with the concepts and assertions of Hegelian dialectics, end quote. Footnote. Letter from Benjamin to Scholem, 16th of September 1924, end footnote. As can be seen from Benjamin's fastidiously maintained index of his readings, he did not ultimately read History and Class Consciousness until 1925. And only 10 years later, in June 1935, could Benjamin report to Adorno that Benjamin had begun, quote, to explore the first volume of, quote, Capital, end quote, an exploration whose results can be found in part in his posthumously published Arcades project. Footnote. Letter from Benjamin to Adorno, 10th of June 1935. It should be noted that Capital, Marx's Capital, is not included in the aforementioned index, the index of books that Benjamin read. The only two works by Marx which are cited therein are the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon and Critique of the Gotha Program, which Benjamin read between June and October 1938. Quote, from Benjamin's carefully maintained reading list, it is clear that Benjamin's passion was not philosophy and certainly not Marxism, but rather literature, end quote. Schneider, 2006. End footnote. An expose or research proposal for the Arcades project, a long planned yet never completed, quote, primal history of the 19th century, end quote, through which Benjamin believed himself to have gradually, quote, reached solid ground in the Marxist discussion, end quote, is the subject of Adorno's so-called Hornberger letter. Footnote. Translator's note. Benjamin produced several drafts of the 1935 expose and Braunstein cites an earlier version which has not been translated into English. Here, the existing English translation of the, quote, final 1935 version is cited, as variations between the two versions are negligible in the passages quoted by Braunstein. End footnote. Written between the 2nd and 5th of August 1935, the letter addresses Benjamin's use of the Marxian critique of economy in extremely critical and, in Adorno's own words, quote, carping manner. Thus, it provides contemporary readers with valuable insight into Adorno's own understanding of the subject, described by Adorno himself as, quote, an extremely detailed counter-expose, end quote, and by Martin Violon as, quote, an act of friendship, comparable to Schiller's role in compelling Goethe to speed up the completion of his Faust project, end quote. The Hornberg letter constitutes an attempt to keep Benjamin from accepting the worldview of dialectical materialism, quote, with closed eyes, end quote. Adorno. Here, Adorno's aim is not only to speed up the completion of the Arcades project, but also to rescue Benjamin's original intention, to preserve the, quote, general approach, end quote, upon which they had agreed. In a 1967 letter to Helmut Heisenbüttel, Adorno responds to the former's accusation that he had made serious omissions in his capacity as the editor of a volume of selected works by Benjamin. Here, expounding on his view of Benjamin's misunderstanding of Marx and how it manifested itself in their discussions, Adorno writes, quote, you appear to suspect I wanted, for whatever reason, to curtail Benjamin's Marxist intentions. My motive in the controversy was actually much more complex. While on the one hand, I specifically wanted to defend Benjamin's metaphysical impulses from himself, I also wanted just as much to defend dialectical materialism from him, which Benjamin appeared to me, in a word, to misinterpret. Not Benjamin alone, but also Brecht. I like to think I know my Marx quite precisely, as you certainly also grant me implicitly. For this reason, I could not overlook that although Benjamin may have professed Marxism, Benjamin did not understand the essential content of Marxian theory. God knows I sing Brecht's merits highly enough, but his ignorance of Marxism, even of notorious matters such as the theory of surplus value, was simply beyond words. Neither studied Marx seriously, but rather, to modify Hobbes' saying about religion, swallowed Marx like a pill, and this appeared dubious to me, heteronomous and irrational, in contrast to materialist dialectics as a theory. If Benjamin had really learned this theory, it would have been better for his own approach, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Letter from Adorno to Heisenbüttel, 14th of March 1967, on the relationship between Benjamin and Brecht. See Isla, 2016, and Müller-Scholl, 2006. On Adorno's aversion to Brecht, see, for example, his reference to, quote, the figure of Brecht, end quote, in a letter to Benjamin, letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 6th of November, 1934, end footnote. Already in a letter to Benjamin from the 5th of June, 1935, Adorno criticizes Benjamin's use of the category of the commodity, urging that this category, quote, is rather too generally expressed in the exposé, as indeed it also was in my Kierkegaard book. But if it is supposed to disclose something specific about the character of the 19th century, and it is not really enough to define the category in purely technological terms, in terms of, quote, fabrication, end quote, say, since it is necessary above all to inquire into the economic function of the same, that is, into the laws of the market within early high capitalism, precisely as the, quote, modern age in the strict sense, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 5th of June, 1935. In one passage in Kierkegaard, which Benjamin praised enthusiastically, the book Kierkegaard, which Benjamin praised enthusiastically for its, quote, groundbreaking analysis, end quote, after first reading, Adorno reflects on both the interiors of upper-class homes, in which one must fear, quote, being turned into a thing oneself, end quote, and on the alienation of the self from things caused by the commodity character more generally. Footnote. For his own part, it was Benjamin, quote, who first focused on the bourgeois intérieur as an expression of bourgeois decay, end quote. Buckmorse, 1977. As Benjamin writes in One Way Street, quote, the bourgeois interior of the 1860s to the 1890s, with its gigantic sideboards distended with carvings, the sunless corners where potted palms sit, the balcony embattled behind its balustrade, and the long corridors with their singing gas flames, fittingly houses only the corpse. Quote, on this sofa the aunt cannot but be murdered, end quote. The soulless luxury of the furnishings becomes true comfort only in the presence of a dead body, end quote. Benjamin. For the Arcades project, Benjamin had planned an entire section, parenthesis, convolute, in parenthesis, on this topic, the notes for which include passages quoted here from Adorno's Kierkegaard. End footnote. Quote, the contents of the interior are mere decoration, alienated from the purposes the contents of the interior represent, deprived of their own use value, engendered solely by the isolated apartment that is created in the first place by their juxtaposition. The, quote, lamp shaped like a flower, end quote. The dream orient, fit together out of a cut paper lampshade hung over its crown and a rug made of osier. The room, an officer's cabin, full of precious decorations, greedily collected across the seas, the complete fata morgana of decadent ornaments, receives its meaning not from the material of which they were made, but from the interior that unifies the imposture of things in the form of a still life. Here in the image, lost objects are conjured. The self is overwhelmed in its own domain by commodities and their historical essence. Their illusory quality is historically, economically produced by the alienation of thing from use value, unquote. Adorno. According to Adorno, alienation causes objects to no longer serve use in a strong sense. The need fulfilled by use no longer precedes things, which now tend first to be produced and only subsequently assigned some use. Already here a highly problematic conception of use value emerges, which can be seen throughout Adorno's work. This conception assumes a transhistorical, quote, use value in itself, end quote, inherent to things beyond economic determinants, which effectively deny that certain things lend themselves to being used in various ways. Hence, Adorno's claim that, quote, the contents of the interior, end quote, are, quote, alienated from the purposes they represent, end quote, and therefore, quote, deprived of their own use value, end quote, setting aside the assumption that there could exist something like a, quote, genuine use value, which certain commodities have lost, an assumption absolutely incompatible with Marxian theory, the notion of, quote, use value in itself, end quote, leads to Adorno's inability in this passage to trace the need for ornamental embellishment manifested in the bourgeois interior back to socioeconomic causes. What he views as, quote, real need, end quote, is simply need which has been socially deformed in the concept of use value. Adorno's second objection concerns Benjamin's deployment of the concept of collective consciousness. In the expose, the new means of production of the 19th century are said to correspond in their form to, quote, wish images, end quote, Wunschbilder, in the collective consciousness, images with which the, quote, collective seeks both to overcome and to transfigure the immaturity of the social product and the inadequacies in the social organization of production, end quote. Benjamin. In a letter to Horkheimer, Adorno claims he, quote, could not accept this concept without an extremely precise articulation of this concept's class character, end quote. As he elaborates shortly thereafter in a letter to Benjamin, quote, the idea of collective consciousness was invented to distract attention from true objectivity, from alienated subjectivity as its correlate. Our task is to polarize and dissolve this, quote, consciousness, end quote, dialectically in terms of society and singular subjects, not to galvanize it as the imagistic correlate of the commodity character. The fact that such a dreaming collective serves to erase the differences between classes should already act as a clear and sufficient warning in this respect. End quote. End quote. Adorno, letter to Benjamin, 2nd to the 5th of August, 1935. End footnote. As the, quote, subject of the collective dream, end quote, the class antagonism of soberly alert reality gets lost among the masses. Therefore, Adorno wants Benjamin to treat the dialectical image more dialectically in order to avoid prematurely reconciling the class antagonism of existing society. Such a reconciliation would portray the opposition between the classes, in spite of its social, that is, objective causes, as a mere idealist construct. In turn, this would give the impression that this opposition could be overcome idealistically through recourse to a kind of ultimate intersubjective inwardness, not requiring a confrontation with empirical social reality. In this context, Adorno also regards as problematic Benjamin's anthropological invocation of an actually existing prehistory in which humanity lived in a, quote, classless society, end quote. Benjamin. Quote, on the one hand, these dream images include the collective idea of a classless society as an anthropological representation of the origin of human history. On the other hand, they acquire a reactionary tinge when mixed with daily impressions in the form of capitalist commodities, end quote. Violon, 2004. In contrast, already in the article, The Actuality of Philosophy, Adorno calls for, quote, the avoidance of invariant general concepts, also perhaps the concept of man, end quote. Adorno. See also the letter from Adorno to Benjamin, footnote. See also the letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 6th of September, 1936. Quote, all those points in which, I differ from you could be summed up and characterized as an anthropological materialism that I cannot accept. It is as if for you the human body represents the measure of all concreteness. But the latter is a, quote, invariant factor, which, as I believe, distorts the decisively concrete. Parenthesis, that is precisely the dialectical rather than the archaic image, end parenthesis. End quote. Adorno. End footnote. Also out of the question for Adorno is Benjamin's solution to, quote, transpose the dialectical image into consciousness as a, quote, dream, end quote. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 2nd to the 5th of August, 1935. Quote, in accordance with your eminent vision of the dialectical image, with which to employ a positive term, I would contrast your earlier conception of a model. You interpret the relationship between the oldest and the newest, one which was already central to your first draft, in terms of a utopian reference to the, quote, classless society, end quote. The archaic therefore becomes a complementary addition to the new, instead of actually being, quote, the newest, end quote, itself, and is therefore rendered undialectical. However, at the same time and equally undialectically, the image of classlessness is projected back into mythology, ... instead of becoming properly transparent as the phantasmagoria of hell. Thus, the category in which the archaic fuses with the modern seems to me more like a catastrophe than a golden age. I once remarked how the recent past always presents itself as though it had been destroyed by catastrophes, hic et nunc. I would say that this is how it presents itself as prehistory, end quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 2nd to the 5th of August, 1935. Footnote. The note to which Adorno refers here is located in Minima Moralia. End footnote. Yet there is another reason why Adorno takes issue with transposing the wish image or dream image into consciousness. Benjamin designates the World's Fairs of the 19th century as the physical manifestation of such images of the collective consciousness, characterizing them as, quote, places of pilgrimage to the commodity fetish, end quote. Benjamin. At the same time, in direct contradiction to Marxism, Benjamin locates the fetish character of the commodity in the consciousness of the dreaming collective. Footnote. In a letter to Scholem, Benjamin writes the following, quote, otherwise, I periodically succumb to the temptations of visualizing analogies with the Baroque book in the book's inner construction, although its external construction decidedly diverges from that of the former. And I want to give you this much a hint. Here, as well, the focus will be on the unfolding of a handed-down concept. Whereas in the former it was the concept of Trauerspiel, here it is likely to be the fetish character of commodities. Whereas the Baroque book mobilized its own theory of history, this will be the case for the, quote, arcades, at least to the same extent, though I can foresee neither whether it will find a form of representation of its own, nor to what extent I may succeed in such a representation. The title, Paris Arcades, has finally been discarded, and the draft is entitled Paris, Capital of the 19th Century. End quote. Privately, I call it Paris, Capitale du... I'm going to say that in French. Siècle, 19th century, implying a further analogy. Just as the Baroque book dealt with the 17th century from the perspective of Germany, this book will unravel the 19th century from France's perspective, end quote. Letter from Benjamin to Scholem, 20th of May, 1935. End footnote. In response, Adorno writes the following, quote, the fetish character of the commodity is not a fact of consciousness. Rather, the fetish character of the commodity is dialectical in character, in the eminent sense that the fetish character of the commodity produces consciousness. But if so, then neither consciousness nor unconsciousness can simply replicate it as a dream, but must respond to it, rather with desire and fear in equal measure. But it is precisely this dialectical power of the fetish character that is forfeited in the replica realism, sit venia verbo, of your current imminent version imminent version of the dialectical image. ... To return to the magnificent language of the first draft of the Arcades project, if the dialectical image is nothing but the way in which the fetish character is perceived in the collective consciousness, then the Saint-Simonian concept of the commodity world might well reveal itself as utopia, but hardly as the reverse, namely as the dialectical image of the 19th century as hell. ... The dialectical image must therefore not be transferred into consciousness as a dream, but rather the dream should be externalized through dialectical interpretation, and the immanence of consciousness itself understood as a constellation of reality, the astronomical phase, as it were. Hell wanders through mankind. It seems to me that it is only a map of such a journey through the stars which could provide a perspicuous vision of history as prehistory. End quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 2nd to the 5th of August, 1935. Regarding another passage in the exposé, which Adorno would cite as at unusual length in his 1950 essay titled Portrait of Walter Benjamin, presumably because it appeared exemplary to Adorno, Adorno becomes more explicit. In this passage, Benjamin discusses the 1944 lithograph Le Pan des Planètes by Grandville. I don't know. Quote, world exhibitions propagate the universe of commodities. Grandville's fantasies confer a commodity character on the universe. They modernize it. Saturn's ring becomes a cast iron balcony on which the inhabitants of Saturn take the evening air. ... Fashion prescribes the ritual according to which the commodity fetish demands to be worshipped. Grandville extends the authority of fashion to objects of everyday use, as well as to the cosmos. In taking it to an extreme, he reveals its nature. Fashion stands in opposition to the organic. Fashion couples the living body to the inorganic world. To the living, fashion defends the rights of the corpse. The fetishism that succumbs to the sex appeal of the inorganic is its vital nerve. The cult of the commodity presses such fetishism into its service. End quote. Benjamin. On the one hand, Adorno objects to Benjamin that in a real fetishistic inversion, quote, the ring of Saturn should not become a cast iron balcony, but the balcony should become the real ring of Saturn, end quote. And that on the other, quote, as was probably your own intention, the conception of the commodity fetishism must be documented with appropriate passages from the man who discovered it, end quote. That is, with passages from Marx's Capital. Footnote. What Benjamin understands by the term, quote, fetishism becomes clear other places in the Arcades project. Quote, the property appertaining to the commodity as its fetish character attaches as well to the commodity producing society, not as it is in itself, to be sure, but more as it represents itself and thinks to understand itself whenever it abstracts from the fact that it produces precisely commodities. End quote. Benjamin. On the redemptive criticism of this understanding of the commodity's fetish character, see Tiedemann. End footnote. In attempting to write a primal history of the 19th century, Adorno continues, Benjamin would need to work out, quote, the specific commodity character of the 19th century. In other words, the industrial production of commodities, much more clearly and substantively, end quote. Given that, quote, all references to the commodity form, quote, as such, lend that history a certain metaphorical character, which in this crucial case cannot be permitted, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 2nd to the 5th of August, 1935. And yet again, Adorno explicitly expresses his misgivings, now without repeatedly emphasizing the failure of his own first habilitation in this regard as well, about, quote, the overly abstract use of the commodity category, end quote. Quote, I am doubtful whether this category appeared, quote, for the first time, end quote, as such in the 19th century. Incidentally, I would say that the same objection also applies to the Intérieur and the Sociology of Interiority in my Kierkegaard book, and every criticism I have made of your draft also holds for my own earlier study. I believe that the commodity category could be rendered much more concrete by reference to the specifically modern categories of world trade and imperialism. End quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 2nd to the 5th of August, 1935. The passage criticized here by Adorno is located in Benjamin, 2002a. End footnote. New section, Masochism. Benjamin's essay titled The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility represents a further source of controversy. Described by Perry Anderson as, quote, Benjamin's most significant theoretical legacy within Marxism, end quote. This text first appeared in French in a 1936 issue of the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, the academic journal of the Institute for Social Research. A German version of the essay was later published in 1955. Asked by Horkheimer for an assessment of Benjamin's work in January 1936, Adorno responded with ambivalence, quote, many of the details specifically on art, as well as some on politics, such as the digression on the concept of the, quote, masses, are quite brilliant, and I quite agree with the demythologization of art. My only issue is, the fundamental objection that bracket Benjamin and bracket mythologizes this demythologization and thus fashions a veritable ontology out of all conceivable abominations, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 21st of March, 1936. Although Adorno claimed in a letter to Benjamin that he finds the latter's, quote, masses digression, quote, to be among the most profound and most powerful statements of political theory I have encountered since I read State and Revolution, end quote. Adorno nevertheless views Benjamin's mythologization of demythologization as grounded in a, quote, masochism stemming from fear of the proletarian element of proletarian revolution, a fear comparable to, quote, the bourgeois artist's fear of the, quote, Philistinism, end quote, of revolution, end quote. Believing Benjamin knows that, quote, this attitude is reactionary, end quote. Adorno sees Benjamin drawing on an undialectical conclusion, the abstract negation of all that is bourgeois and not genuinely proletarian. Footnote. In the article, The Present Social Situation of the French Writer, his first essay published in the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, Benjamin writes of the difficulty of turning towards the proletariat as an intellectual. Quote, the fact that these intellectuals have abandoned their own class in order to make common cause with the proletariat does not mean that the latter have accepted them into their ranks, nor have they, end quote. Benjamin. Additionally, in a 1930 conversation with Brecht, Benjamin claimed that, quote, today's situation precedes the seizure of power by the proletariat, end quote, which Brecht objected, quote, cannot be assumed, end quote. During a discussion at the 16th German Sociological Congress, Adorno confirmed that Benjamin believed, quote, as did Marx, that a radical transformation of the world through powerful social forces was imminent, end quote. End footnote. Invoking Marx, Benjamin's essay formulates, quote, theses defining the tendencies of the development of art under the present conditions of production, end quote. Theses which Benjamin explicitly claims stand to, quote, contribute to the political struggle, end quote, not least by, quote, being useful for the formulation of revolutionary demands in the politics of art, end quote. Benjamin. According to Benjamin, the work of art previously sustained itself on aura, yet this is precisely what, quote, withers in the age of technological reproducibility, end quote. Benjamin. The aura of so-called autonomous artworks was rooted in their authenticity, the, quote, here and now of the original, end quote. Although the aura now finds itself in a time of crisis, ostensibly autonomous artworks, the descendants of, quote, the earliest artworks, end quote, which themselves, quote, originated in the service of rituals, first magical, then religious, end quote, still continue to invoke the magical religious aura. This can be seen with the advent of photography, to which art, quote, reacted with the doctrine of l'art pour l'art, that is, with a theology of art. This in turn gave rise to a negative theology in the form of an idea of, quote, pure art, which rejects not only any social function, but any definition in terms of a representational content, end quote. Benjamin. Here Benjamin wants to indicate, quote, a future state of the world liberated from magic, end quote. Benjamin. However, Adorno accuses Benjamin of prematurely surrendering magic to irrationality without reflecting on magic's enlightening substance. Footnote. In doing so, Adorno already gestures towards a central insight of dialectic of enlightenment, as well as the phenomenon described by its title. Quote, myth is already enlightenment, and enlightenment reverts to mythology, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. End footnote. Quote, I now find it somewhat disturbing, and here I can see a sublimated remnant of certain Brechtian themes, that you have now rather casually transferred the concept of the magical aura to the, quote, autonomous work of art, end quote, and flatly assigned a counter-revolutionary function to the latter. I do not need to assure you just how aware I am of the magical element that persists in the bourgeois work of art, ... However, it seems to me that the heart of the autonomous work of art does not itself belong to the dimension of myth. Forgive my topical manner of speaking, but is inherently dialectical. That is, compounds within itself the magical element with the sign of freedom. End quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 18th of March, 1936. Footnote. Bernhard Reich also criticizes the, quote, the work of art essay, the work of art's essay's one-sided account of aura in a letter to Benjamin, quote, in your work, the shattering of aura appears as something positive, although you make an effort to support your claim thusly. The uniqueness of the artwork is bound up with ritual, which means that the destruction of aura is a destruction of rituals. No doubt in times when art is most closely bound up with the religious, ... Ritual penetrates all characteristics of the artwork, and hence also the artwork's uniqueness. In my opinion, you make a mistake by only and always wanting to see a particular concentration of the ritualistic in the uniqueness of the artwork. I think that the highly personal relationship to the work of art and the expression of the highly personal within it will also take place under socialism and will even grow more intense. End quote. Letter from Bernhard Reich to Benjamin, 19th of February 1936. End footnote. Writing to Horkheimer in March 1936, Adorno claims that Benjamin's, quote, masochism allows him to, quote, forget the dialectical counterpart, end quote, of the magical and the mythical in their entirety. Benjamin, quote, first throws out the baby with the bathwater and, then worships the empty tub, end quote. That is, demythologized artworks which have been de-rationalized precisely through their demythologization, quote. On the one hand, Benjamin perceives far too little the progressive intentions of, quote, autonomous art, intentions which aim at good rationality and technological empowerment. When it comes to such intentions, he completely forsakes dialectics while liquidating dialectics with a promptness and a terseness which seem to me to damage the liquid assets. On the other hand, in the realm of technological capitalist art, the realm of the cinema, ultimately the most alienated art of all, Benjamin invents theories which stand to serve the most base capitalist practice. I certainly share Benjamin's view that the lowest things are dialectical through and through, but this would just as well require a dialectics of the highest production, something I long ago expressed by explaining that in music it comes down to Schoenberg and Schlager. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Translator's note. A style of German popular music with folk origins originated in the early 20th century. End footnote. Adorno regards the essay's approach as, quote, masochistic, because he sees Benjamin attempting within it to, quote, outdo Brecht in radicalism, end quote. And then, after having dared to master his bourgeois fear of the proletariat and the proletarian revolution, quote, tightly shutting his eyes, sticking cotton in his ears, and emphatically screaming, all things he is afraid of, end quote. However, for Adorno, quote, the issue runs deeper, namely to fear itself, end quote. Quote, revolution is supposed to eliminate anxiety and barbarity, and we need not fear revolution, but rather what currently exists. Yet although we need not fear revolution, we also do not have to revere revolution, in abstract overexcitement. Politically speaking, this means simply that the proletariat needs the intellectuals for revolution just as much as the intellectuals need the proletariat, whereas Benjamin, and this is in fact the worst of Brecht, places his trust in the proletariat as though it were a blind world spirit, tolerating specifically those characteristics of it which were produced by bourgeois machinery, characteristics which are precise tasks to transform with knowledge. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. In a letter to Scholem from the mid-1960s, Siegfried Krakauer writes the following, quote, I once had a heated confrontation with Benjamin in Berlin regarding his slavish, masochistic attitude towards Brecht. But it's better if I tell you about it sometime in person, end quote. Letter from Krakauer to Scholem, 23rd of May, 1965. A subsequent meeting between Krakow and Scholem would never come about. End footnote. Adorno expresses his criticism of the theses for the first time in a letter to Benjamin, also written in March 1936. Here, Adorno primarily takes issue with the application of the concept of the magical aura to the autonomous artwork, which he claims is thereby assigned a counter-revolutionary function. As he had already written in 2 years prior to Ernst Krenek, quote, "The redemption of art from liturgical function," end quote, is a process, quote, "which since the middle of the 16th century has thoroughly belonged to the bourgeois world and has fallen under the category of, quote, reification. Yet it is a quite superficial view, when at best held by sociologists of bracket Hans and bracket Eisler's crudity. That this, quote, reification, end quote, is undialectically, quote, negative, socially irrelevant, and arbitrarily correctable through some sort of community art. Quote, reification is itself much more an expression of a fundamental social fact, one which can be discerned from the model of economy, specifically from the character of the commodity and the division of labor, which necessarily remains in effect as long as the old, quote, immediacy in the relationship between human being and thing, and our artworks are unavoidably things, has not been restored. While this restoration may be constantly desired by some anarchism-infected Marxists who have not understood Marx, I regard it as base and reactionary, and therefore regard attempts to modify the purpose of art as base and reactionary as well. Here I am clearly opposed to Brecht and also to certain intentions of Benjamin," end quote. Adorno to Ernst Krenek, 7th of October 1934. End footnote. The work of art essay renewed Adorno's misgivings about Benjamin's work, just as with the expose to the Arcades project, Adorno criticizes in a letter to Benjamin the lack of, quote, dialectical penetration, end quote, of the subject matter. In this case, quote, the autonomy of the work of art, and therefore the work of art's material form, end quote. For Adorno, an artwork's autonomy and material form are, quote, not identical with the magical elements within it. The reification of a great work of art is not simply a matter of loss, any more than the reification of the cinema is all loss. It would be a reactionary bourgeois gesture to negate the reification of the cinema in the name of the ego, and it would border on anarchism to revoke the reification of a great work of art in the spirit of an immediate appeal to use value. Les extrêmes me touchent as they do you, but only if the dialectic of the lowest has the same value as the dialectic of the highest, and not if the latter is simply left to decay. Both bear the stigmata of capitalism, both contain elements of change, both are torn halves of an integral freedom, to which, however, they do not add up. It would be romantic to sacrifice one side to the other, one to the other, either with that bourgeois romanticism which seeks to uphold the, quote, personality and such like mystification, or with that anarchistic romanticism which places blind trust in the spontaneous powers of the proletariat within the historical process, a proletariat which is itself a product of bourgeois society, end quote. Adorno, in a letter to Benjamin, 18th of March 1936. Footnote. Here Adorno is supported by the following passage from the Communist Manifesto, quote, "But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to the bourgeoisie's self, the bourgeoisie has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians," end quote. Apropos, les extrêmes me touchent, at the beginning of the introduction to his 1948 Philosophy of New Music, Adorno quotes a sentence from Benjamin's The Origin of German Tragic Drama. Quote, philosophical history as the research of origin is the form that, in the most remote extremes, in the apparent excesses of development, reveals the configuration of the idea as the configuration of the totality, characterized by the possibility of a meaningful juxtaposition of these extremes, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Whereas Benjamin sees in the proletariat the, quote, most enlightened form of class consciousness, end quote, Adorno argues in an entirely un-Lukashian manner against relying on revolutionary proletarian self-consciousness. Workers, quote, in fact enjoy no advantage over their bourgeois counterparts apart from their interest in the revolution, and otherwise bear all the marks of mutilation of the typical bourgeois character. End quote. Adorno. While intellectuals such as Benjamin and himself must, quote, in full knowledge and without intellectual inhibitions, maintain our solidarity at the proletariat, end quote. Intellectuals must also refrain from, quote, making our necessity into a virtue of the proletariat, as we are constantly tempted to do, that proletariat which itself experiences the same necessity and needs us for knowledge just as much as we need the proletariat for the revolution, end quote. Furthermore, just as Adorno had done previously in his letter to Horkheimer, Adorno writes to Benjamin that the, quote, goal of revolution is the elimination of anxiety. That is why we need not fear the former and need not ontologize the latter, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 18th of March, 1936. In Theorie der Gesellschaft, Theory of Society, Adorno's lecture course from the winter semester of 1949 to 1950, Adorno would still adhere to the idea that if society were genuinely transcended, this would benefit everyone. That is, that this would only be possible if all forms of domination were transcended. Quote, if critique of society were only the interest of a class and not humanity specifically, it would not be deserving of one shot's worth of gunpowder, end quote. Adorno. New section, Arcade's Orthodoxy. A third controversy over Benjamin's use of Marxian terminology is connected to Adorno's reception of the article The Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire. At Horkheimer's request, Benjamin wrote this text in 1938 for publication in the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, although the journal rejected the first draft. Footnote, see letters from Adorno to Benjamin, 2nd of July 1937 and 13th of September 1937. End footnote. In a letter from November 1938, Adorno asked Benjamin to, quote, forego publication of the present version, end quote, citing similar misgivings to those he had expressed regarding the exposé to the Arcades project, as well as the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility. Above all, Adorno alleges, quote, a lack of mediation between pragmatic substance and Marxian theory, leading to a, quote, materialistic historiographical evocation, end quote, of socio-historical motifs, end quote. Schminder and Werner, 2006, quoted from letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 10th of November, 1938. And footnote. The missing mediation of which Adorno writes is mediation between, quote, conspicuous individual features from the realm of the superstructure, end quote, and the, quote, corresponding features of the substructure, end quote. A mediation that can only be achieved theoretically, however, quote, through the total social process, end quote. This means unpacking, quote, the overall social and economic tendencies of the age, end quote, rather than, quote, imputing to phenomena precisely the kind of spontaneity, tangibility, and density which they have lost under capitalism, end quote. Quote, to express this another way, the theological motif of calling things by their names tends to switch into the wide-eyed presentation of mere facts. If one wanted to put it rather drastically, one could say that your study is located at the crossroads of magic and positivism. This spot is bewitched. Only theory could break this spell. Your own resolute and salutarily speculative theory. It is simply the claim of this theory that I bring against you here, end quote. Adorno to Benjamin, 10th of November, 1938. Having expected the Baudelaire essay to provide, quote, a model for the Arcades project, end quote, Adorno must now recognize that Benjamin had written nothing more than, quote, a prelude to the latter. Motifs are assembled, but they are not elaborated, end quote. Adorno to Benjamin, 10th of November, 1938. Once again, Adorno involves his own work in his criticism, this time referring to his essay on Wagner, quote, no one is more aware of the problems involved here than I am. The Phantasmagoria chapter of my book on Wagner has certainly not succeeded in resolving them yet, end quote. Adorno to Benjamin, 10th of November, 1938. Moreover, precisely with regards to the Baudelaire essay, it is quite evident that Adorno is trying, quote, to defend Benjamin's metaphysical impulses from himself, end quote, as he would later write to Heisenbüttel. In his own words, Adorno brings his Arcades orthodoxy to bear against Benjamin in order to remind Benjamin of his own intentions, and to keep Benjamin from sacrificing these to an ostensible, yet in reality quite superficial Marxism. Footnote. Continuing, Adorno writes that his wife Gretel, quote, once jokingly remarked that you, Benjamin, dwell in the cavernous depths of your arcades, and that you shrink from completing the study because you're afraid of leaving what you have built. We would exhort you to offer us some access to the Holy of Holies. I am sure you do not have to worry either about the stability of the structure or its profanation, end quote. Adorno to Benjamin. End footnote. Quote, your solidarity with the Institute, bracket, for Social Research, in bracket, which pleases no one more than myself, has led you to pay the kind of tributes to Marxism which are appropriate neither to Marxism nor to yourself. Not appropriate to Marxism because the mediation through the entire social process is missing, and because of a superstitious tendency to attribute to mere material enumeration a power of illumination, which really belongs to the theoretical construction alone rather than to purely pragmatic illusions. Not appropriate to your own individual nature because you have denied yourself your boldest and most fruitful ideas through a kind of pre-censorship in accordance with materialist categories, parenthesis, which by no means correspond to Marxist categories, in parenthesis. ... God knows there's only one true. God knows there's only one truth. And if your powers of intelligence can seize this one truth through categories, which may seem apocryphal to you, given your conception of materialism, then you will capture more of this one truth than you will ever do by employing the conceptual tools that merely resist your grip at every turn. End quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 10th of November 1938. By way of example, Adorno refers to the following passage from Benjamin's essay, quote, "If there were such a thing as a commodity soul," parenthesis, a notion that Marx occasionally mentions in jest, in parenthesis, "it would be the most emphatic ever encountered in the realm of souls. For this commodity soul would be bound to see every individual as a buyer in whose hand and house it wants to nestle. Empathy is the nature of the intoxication to which the flaneur abandons himself in the crowd." End quote. Benjamin. Footnote. In capital, Marx writes the following, quote, "If commodities could speak, commodities would say this: our use value may interest men, but our use value does not belong to us as objects. What does belong to us as objects, however, is our value. Our own intercourse as commodities proves it. We relate to each other merely as exchange values. Now listen how these commodities speak through the mouth of the economist." End quote. Marx. Marx subsequently quotes two economists. In the Arcades Project, Benjamin notes that, quote, "empathy with the commodity is fundamentally empathy with exchange value itself. The flaneur is the virtuoso of this empathy. The flaneur takes the concept of marketability itself for a stroll, just as his final ambit is the department store, his last incarnation is the sandwich man." End quote. Benjamin. Quote, "Here, Benjamin implicitly references Lukács's model of a revolutionary transcendence of the capitalist form of objectivity through the ... proletariat which has arrived via class consciousness at the, quote, self-consciousness of the commodity," end quote. As precursor of this consciousness, empathy with the commodity gives form to the distorted dream, quote, in which each epoch entertains images of that epoch's successor, end quote. The action of the flaneur objects to reified rationality by internalizing its principle of bringing all that is social into object form, and specifically into the form of atomized experiences, end quote. Schlette, 2000. End footnote. Regarding this claim, Adorno suggests that Benjamin, quote, once again pay particularly careful attention to this theory and compare with the chapter on commodity fetishism in the first volume of Capital, end quote. In other words, here again another self-proclaimed Marxist thesis of Benjamin's, quote, must be documented with appropriate passages, end quote, from the man who first articulated the fetish character of commodities. Quote, you may be confident that we are prepared to make your most extreme theoretical experiments our own, end quote. Adorno assures Benjamin, quote, but we are equally confident on our part that you will actually carry out these experiments, end quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 10th of November, 1938. So it was that Benjamin embarked on a new Baudelaire essay for the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, which Adorno and Horkheimer would enthusiastically accept for publication in the journal's first issue of 1939. Footnote, in a letter to Benjamin following the arrival of the new version, Adorno writes that his, quote, enthusiasm about the Baudelaire increases steadily, end quote. Letter from Gretel and Theodore W. Adorno to Benjamin, 21st of November, 1939. End footnote. Let me reread that last sentence. So it was that Benjamin embarked on a new Baudelaire essay for the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, which Adorno and Horkheimer would enthusiastically accept for publication in the journal's first issue of 1939. Philosophically, Adorno doubtlessly owes more to Benjamin than anyone else, more indeed than even to Horkheimer. Quote, every comparative reading of their writings makes evident the heretofore insufficiently researched degree to which Adorno took up concepts and motifs of thought from his older friend. These are reflected only indirectly by Adorno's texts with their anti-academic renunciation of footnotes and references. Adornian concepts such as nucleus of time, Zeitkern, truth content, Wahrheitsgehalt, Wahrheitsgehalt, myth, mythos, monad, monada, guilt context, Schuldzusammenhang, language, Sprache, writing, Schrift, redemption, Erlösung, remembrance, Eingedenken, natural history, Naturgeschichte, and mimetic comportment, mimetisches Verhalten, originate, regardless of how they are altered from the context of Benjamin's writings, end quote. Lindner, 1983. Nevertheless, it is also the case that a development in Adorno's critique of political economy, one in which Adorno was able to explicate and substantiate Adorno's own insight as a Marxist philosopher, took place in direct confrontation with Benjamin, and that studying the writings of Benjamin was not instructive for Adorno in this development. Not only does Adorno's letter to Heisenbuttel attest to the fact that in question of political economy, the relation between Adorno and Benjamin was not one of mutual learning and teaching. In his correspondence with Benjamin himself, Adorno was also much more of a, quote, critical partner, end quote, who did not hold back his judgments. Footnote. Broderson indicates that, quote, the intellectual relationship between Adorno and Benjamin was probably at times viewed by the two men themselves through the categories of, quote, student and, quote, teacher, with the roles corresponding to their ages, end quote. However, the fact that Adorno, to whom friendship did not mean withholding criticism when discussing the questions dealt with there, did not want to play a, quote, role towards Benjamin, is characterized negatively by Broderson, quote, and when the relationship between them later, but still during Benjamin's lifetime, virtually reversed, with the former student bringing himself to criticize his teacher. Adorno's letters to Benjamin and others are a sad example of this. This circumstance was certainly not least the result of the fact that Adorno was never prepared to draw from the historical experiences of his time similar consequences to those drawn by Benjamin. Benjamin's rejection of an esoteric style of thinking and writing, which was already elevated to program with the conclusion of the book on tragic drama, was something Adorno wanted neither to comprehend nor accept, end quote. End footnote. Adorno was also much more of a, quote, critical partner, end quote, who did not hold back his judgments. So it is that Adorno comments in a note from his final years that Benjamin's, quote, knowledge and understanding of Marx were extremely limited, end quote. Adorno. At the same time, however, Adorno's critique of Benjamin takes a redemptive turn. This can be seen when he refers to Benjamin's, quote, form of Marxism, which he wanted to take over in orthodox form, as doctrine, without any inkling of the kind of productive misunderstanding he thereby set in motion, end quote. Adorno. Quote, it would be unfair to juxtapose, end quote, this form of Marxism, which is hardly orthodox but rather had been, quote, worked out by Benjamin himself, quote, to Marx's own theory, end quote. Adorno. Quote, with his emancipation from Benjamin, the phase in which Adorno's basic philosophical positions were formulated can be viewed as complete. His American emigration marks the beginning of his truly productive time, during which the manifold impulses from the interwar period reach maturity. End quote. Patazzi. New section, section 6. Zun Retzel, such a riddle. Section 6. However, though it has been claimed that Adorno was, quote, fascinated by Benjamin's elaborations on the, quote, commodity fetish, end quote, and specifically by the idea of, quote, real abstraction, end quote, as presented in Zone Ratel's Apocrypha, end quote, this assumption is incorrect. And that quote was from Hofner. In discussion of Adorno's understanding of economy, Alfred Zone Rettel, I always feel like I'm pronouncing that guy's name. Alfred Zone Rettel. I used to say Ratel, but that's not right. Is often pointed to as the very first person to familiarize Adorno with the critique of political economy and as the decisive influence on Adorno's philosophy in general. This claim is primarily supported by an enthusiastic letter from Adorno to Zone Rettel, and by the fact that the latter is mentioned in a passage in Negative Dialectics. However, the relationship between the two, both biographically and intellectually, was not nearly as harmonious as it may at times appear. Footnote. Among others, Alfred Zone Rettel himself repeatedly refers back to this letter, lastly in Intellectual and Manual Labor. However, Tiedemann correctly notes that this particular letter, quote, does not come close to adequately representing either Adorno's objective position or Adorno's personal relationship, end quote, to Zone Rettel, quote, as is documented more or less by their entire correspondence, end quote. Tiedemann, quoted in Huga, 2008, end footnote. However, the relationship between the two, both biographically and intellectually, was not nearly as harmonious as it may at times appear. Adorno met Zone Rettel in September 1925 during a stay in Capri. Benjamin, Bloch, and Krakauer were also there at the time. 1 year later, in hopes of gaining the financial support of the Institute for Social Research, Zone Rettel sent a document titled Exposé zum theoretischen Kommentar der Marxischen Gesellschaftslehre, or Exposé of the Theoretical Commentary on Marxian Social Theory, to Adorno and Krakauer in Frankfurt, still unpublished to this day. This typescript, quote, begins with a bold preliminary remark, quote, if one critically examines the theoretical foundation of Marxian social theory, capital, it is evident that none of its elements stand up to thorough criticism. This means that none of the basic intentions which define the system as a whole find their identical coherent realization in Marxian concepts, or that when expressed in Marxian concepts, these intentions stand everywhere askance to the objective nature of things, end quote. Zone Rettel wants to conceptually clarify Marx and to construct a, quote, rationalized parallel system to capital, end quote. Zone Rettel wants to untangle the, quote, inextricable knot, end quote, produced by Marx. Marx, who, quote, through his errors glossed over the erroneousness of the world, only to recognize its other form in the twilight of the mist, which has become transparent. end quote, is said to need Sohn-Rettel's commentary to translate, quote, his theory from its violent language into the lesser non-violent yet identical language of things, end quote. However, the concluding sentence of the expose, quote, this is how we want at present to build philosophy into the stronghold of our last hope, exclamation point, end quote, gives the impression that a systematic philosophy of the kind Sohn-Rettel is proposing tends to keep its distance from the world and to be at home in a defensive stronghold, end quote. Freitag, 2006. Moreover, this sentence also implies that Benjamin, who was skeptical of Sohn-Rettel, had been acquainted with Sohn-Rettel's, quote, rationalized parallel system, end quote. In a letter to Adorno, Benjamin sardonically refers to Sohn-Rettel as the, quote, high priest of economics in his misty stronghold, end quote. Letter from Benjamin to Adorno, 11th of February, 1938. In any case, Adorno was unimpressed by Sohn-Rettel's expose. Adorno's opinion was shared by Krakauer, whom Adorno sent a devastating critique of the text. Quote, the framework, like the basis, is completely inadequate, ... and what a murky block, like as in Ernst Bloch, like confusion, Sohn-Rettel stirs up with his concept of the transcendental, and how wrong, at least like Benjaminian ideas, and how unbroken are the metaphysics perching on top of it. Sohn-Rettel misses the entire content of Marxism in Heidelberg fashion and gives it the spurious, profound quality of a dilettante. ... The banal rejection, bracket, of Sohn, bracket, by every communist would, bracket, be even more justified than the rejection of, and bracket, Lukács, of whom he is a Goyish pastoral incarnation minus the mask. No, this book is no use, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Krakauer, 17th of September, 1926, end footnote. 10 years later, Sohn-Rettel sent Adorno his so-called, quote, Lucerna expose, quote, a lengthy letter expounding on lines of thought for a further draft. Footnote, later published under the title Soziologische Theorie der Erkenntnis. End footnote. In contrast to the earlier expose, it elicited an enthusiastic response in which Adorno calls it, quote, the greatest intellectual shock I experienced in philosophy since my encounter with Benjamin's work in 1923, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Sohn-Rettel, 17th of November, 1936. It is possible to distinguish between four areas of work Sohn-Rettel pursued during his life. 1. The discovery of the, quote, transcendental subject, end quote, in the commodity form. 2. The common genesis of the commodity form and forms of thought in the logic of exploitation and appropriation. 3. The separation of intellectual and manual labor. 4. Fascism theory. Footnote. Lastly, expounded upon an intellectual and manual labor. That's referring to the separation of intellectual and manual labor. Demirovich criticizes this aspect of Sohn-Rettel's work. Quote, Sohn-Rettel's considerations tend towards an abstract theory of derivation which easily becomes unhistorical insofar as its sole concentration on the form of the commodity means that it cannot address different stages of capitalist social formation and of the relationship between intellectual and manual labor, end quote. Demirovich. I'm not an expert on Sohn-Rettel. I have read Intellectual and Manual Labor, although a lot of it is kind of beyond me, if I'm to be completely honest with you. But there's a book called like Marx and Critical Theory, or Marx and I don't know, but it's like a compendium of essays put out about Zonrettel. Um, and one of the best ones is John Milios, who's kind of like, I guess, one of the I think it's Giannis Milios, but I think he goes in between either of them. Any Hooser, but he talks about, and this is something that I think is very interesting. He talks about how like Zonrettel kind of fails to acknowledge the specificity of capitalism, insofar as capitalism is the system in which the commodity form becomes generalized. And for it to become general, and if you were talking about the influence of like the commodity and exchange on like human thinking, you would have to talk about primarily about how it's been that's come to pass in capitalism when society has become thoroughly permeated by exchange for basically, everything you do, it depends upon the purchases and sales. Whereas Zonrettel takes the commodity form as like a dominant form of like social intercourse and pushes it way back to like early Greek civilization, which was in I think one of the more interesting critiques or comments I've heard about Zonrettel is this kind of like I don't know, pushing the logic of the commodity back in time, kind of anachronistically. Not that like there wasn't exchange at all in ancient Greece, but that it remained very much a secondary phenomenon. At least that was basically like Milios's critique. So it's kind of like, whereas other people try to get really into the specificity of like what capitalism is, right? Capitalism as a system is like when like the logic of commodities is like kind of penetrates into like production, right? It's not just kind of like incidental exchange or exchange of only like a select number of use values, but and that where like engagement with the market is kind of like semi-optional and is more of like an opportunity, whereas in a capitalist society, the production of commodities and the competitive production of commodities becomes an imperative on producers, right? Whether that be capitalist firms or even just say farmers who have to sell their produce as opposed to just making produce in a self-subsistence kind of way. So there's like a like say like political Marxism, right? Or like, which is primarily looks at capitalism through like a historical lens as opposed to like kind of like a logical lens of like its necessary features, as in like value form theory, for instance, which is not like they're usually, I don't think anyone in value form theory is a historian. They're all like philosophers and like economists, who are mostly about like theoretical economics as opposed to like writing economic history, right? But yeah, they push them, for instance, like they push, they think capitalism really starts in a very localized part of the world, primarily England, for a long time before it penetrates into other parts of the world. Anyway, I'm getting carried away with myself, but that's just a thought that I had. It's like one of the main things, like a lot of Zonrettel stuff kind of almost sounds like noise to me. Like I don't really have the skill set, the intellectual like sophistication to really comprehend what's being said and actually like kind of like chew on it. Just kind of like smacks me in the face. As a lot of Adorno as well. That's the one thing that like commenting on Zonrettel that seemed particularly insightful. Anyway, The letter by Zone Rettel, which so excited Adorno, primarily relates to the second point, while presenting, quote, two insights, end quote, which the expose itself pursues. The first insight consists of the claim, quote, that the historical development of theory, independent from the practical material being of humans, and endowed with the appearance of logical autonomy, that is, the historical development of, quote, knowledge, in every idealistic sense, can ultimately be explained alone by a unique and extremely profound break in the practice of human existence, end quote. Zone Rettel to Adorno. This break is said to be, quote, the fact of exploitation in the elementary sense that one part of society lives on the products of the labor of the other part, end quote. Zone Rettel to Adorno, 12th of November, 1936. Zone Rettel's second insight can be summarized with his concept of, quote, functional socialization, end quote, which for Zone Rettel, quote, is the decisive approach for analyzing and dialectically bursting open the, quote, commodity form and the relationships which hide it, end quote. Zone Rettel. As Zone Rettel writes, functional socialization is a form of socialization which, quote, is based on absolutely no natural human relationship, but rather on the exploitation of humans with respect to their relationship to nature. It occurs only in relationships between humans, while of course requiring that exploited humans relate to nature as producers, but in order that involves their relationship to nature in their entirely different order, and in doing so transform all internal features of this relationship. Hence, functional socialization is the interweaving of human existence through exploitation and is always materially mediated, that is, mediated through appropriated products as things existing identically. This socializing form through which things are mediated, or even more precisely, the essential identity of these things as objects appropriate in an exploitative relationship, is the foundation of the, quote, commodity form, end quote. End quote. Letter from Zone Rettel to Adorno, 12th of November, 1936. In a letter to Benjamin, Adorno reports that, quote, from a quite different angle, Zone Rettel has arrived at certain conclusions which are remarkably similar to those of my own current efforts, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 28th of November, 1936. Here Adorno refers to his work on Husserl, which he was pursuing at the time under the auspices of attaining a PhD from Oxford in order to teach there. Responding to Zone Rettel directly, Adorno praises the, quote, greatness and might, end quote, of his idea before promising, quote, that I at the Institute will do everything I can for your work, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. In a letter to Horkheimer, Benjamin reports that Zone Rettel's, quote, two most important, end quote, theses are, quote, the derivation of commodity exchange from exploitation and the derivation of purely theoretical thought from the commodity economy, end quote. Noting that Adorno is, quote, in his most recent works particularly wedded to Zone Rettel's second thesis, which the difficulties of articulating seem to me to be the greatest, end quote. Letter from Benjamin to Horkheimer, 28th of March, 1937. End footnote. Footnote. Provisionally titled The Doctrines of Intellectual Intuition and Intentionality in the, quote, Phenomenological Philosophy of Edmund Husserl, this work was never completed due to Adorno's move to the United States. Written between 1934 and 37, the manuscript provided Adorno with material for his book Against Epistemology, a Metacritique, which he wrote after returning to Germany. See Adorno's own account of the book Origins in Adorno 2013, as well as that of Ralph Tiedemann in Tiedemann 2003. According to Alfred Schmidt, This book is, quote, not actually a contribution to Husserl research, but rather a study occasioned by Husserl. It is the ingenious attempt to convey the idealist character of all originary philosophy. Ursprungsphilosophy. Even that which gestures materialistically, end quote. Alfred Schmidt. End footnote. Responding to Sohn Rettel directly, Adorno praises the, quote, greatness and might, end quote, of his idea, before promising that, quote, that I at the Institute will do everything I can for your work, end quote. However, this would not amount to much. Adorno, quote, urgently, quote, advises Horkheimer to materially enable Sohn Rettel to develop his exposé. However, Horkheimer replies that his and Adorno's, quote, opinions on Sohn Rettel's work unfortunately diverge, end quote. Letter from Horkheimer to Adorno, 8th of December 1936. Horkheimer's diplomatic yet thoroughly critical letter to Sohn Rettel, quote, to Sohn Rettel regarding his exposé. Letter from Horkheimer to Sohn Rettel, 25th of November 1936. End footnote. Suspecting Adorno has, quote, simply let himself be blinded by Sohn Rettel's great intelligence, end quote. Horkheimer himself claims to find, quote, Sohn Rettel's perpetual assurance that whatever odd proofs must be provided revealing whatever odd, quote, geneses, end quote, from existence or from history or from the development of man's existence or from the deepest roots of the existence of man in his history to be synonymous with the truth problem of consciousness or with the question of knowledge's validity or with the practice of society to be infinitely tedious and uninteresting, end quote. Horkheimer. Letter from Horkheimer to Adorno, 8th of December 1936. Ultimately, Horkheimer maintains that, quote, this Sohn Rettel absolutely does not stand in real contrast to what we hate, end quote. Letter from Horkheimer to Adorno, 11th of January 1937. Referring specifically here to Sohn Rettel's, quote, entirely formal, end quote, use of, quote, the concept of exploitation, end quote, Horkheimer continues that, quote, it would be a mistake to believe that idealism can be overcome by simply replacing idealist terms with those from a materialist theory. This merely gives the appearance of actuality without actually changing anything, end quote. Horkheimer to Adorno, 11th of January 1937. However, Horkheimer mainly objects to Sohn Rettel for another reason, namely, quote, that Sohn Rettel constantly submits his thesis as articulations of problems for future explorations, thereby giving the impression that everything he says will eventually find scholarly support, and that he is only dealing provisionally in hypotheses. Yet the scientific credit which Sohn Rettel claims in this way must be discounted if one realizes that precisely Sohn Rettel's method testifies in various resumes against the expectations of such future evidence, end quote. Horkheimer. For Horkheimer, the difficulty involved in setting down in a work what Sohn Rettel's various exposés only ever gesture towards is the result of, quote, a deep internal ambiguity which will not diminish over time, end quote. Horkheimer to Adorno, 24th of May, 1937. After his initial enthusiasm, Adorno increasingly adopted Horkheimer's opinion of Sohn Rettel. In a 1937 letter to Benjamin, Adorno reveals himself to be disillusioned that, quote, Sohn Rettel, end quote, his new nickname for Benjamin's, quote, high priest of economics, end quote, is a slight corruption of Sohn Rettel translating to, quote, such a riddle, end quote. Quote, is eagerly trying to rediscover the man who first started on the work in order to disable him completely, and that he is far more interested in spinning things out into the indeterminate future than he is in completing anything within a foreseeable period of time, end quote. Adorno to Benjamin, 27th of November, 1937. Footnote. On this point, Philip von Vossov refers laconically to Zohnrettel's, quote, laziness. C. von Vussalv, 2007, end footnote. In light of ever new exposés arriving at lengthy intervals, Horkheimer's skepticism of Zohnrettel's ability to follow his own program appeared to have been confirmed. Footnote. Zohnrettel himself counts 7 exposés, the last of which was written for the last German edition of Intellectual and Manual Labor, and, quote, still leaves many questions open, end quote. Quote, my entire path is plastered with these elaborations bearing the name exposés, the majority of which still rot in my drawer, end quote. Zohnrettel, 1989. I don't know, I guess that's the publication of the thing. I don't know what 1989 is. I don't know when Zohnrettel died. End footnote. Footnote. Quote, I would like to know what's happening with Alfred Zohn. Of course, his exposé still has not arrived, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 20th of April, 1937. Referring to Zohnrettel's work in a letter from the following year, Gretel Adorno writes to Benjamin that, quote, naturally, we do not get to see any of the results, end quote. Letter from Gretel Adorno to Benjamin, 1st of February, 1938. End footnote. Following the failure of Zohnrettel's attempt to work out a final version of the Lucerna exposé, contact between Zohnrettel and Adorno largely broke off, only to be resumed on occasion. Footnote. In a letter from August 1944, Zohnrettel laments to Adorno, quote, I have written you letters and sent you 2 manuscripts and have never had from you a proper reply, ... Nothing about your work and plans as you had led me to hope, and not a word of criticism of my own stuff. I don't consider this very comradely, and for the life of me I can't see the reason, end quote. Letter from Zohnrettel to Adorno, 20th of August, 1944. Adorno's next letter to Zohnrettel is dated 1958, end footnote. Adorno himself barely continued to follow Zohnrettel's project to, quote, derive the Kantian deduction of the categories from the commodity form and the commodity form's dialectic, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 23rd of November, 1936. In 1965, a letter to Lucien Goldmann, who had never heard of Zohnrettel, Adorno writes that the latter, quote, has been working for many a long year on a problem with which Zohnrettel is downright obsessed, the derivation of the Western tradition's epistemological categories from the exchange relation, end quote. Adorno. After describing this work as, quote, the quite energetic and manifold attempt to push further certain approaches from the reification chapter from history and class consciousness into a Marxian epistemology, end quote. Adorno notes, quote, just now, Zohnrettel submitted to me his most recent draft from the complex, bracket, the lecture, quote, Warenform und Denkform, end quote, commodity form and thought form. Tomorrow he will visit me here, end quote. The correspondence between Adorno and Zohnrettel during this time suggests that the former never read the draft in question. On balance, Zohnrettel is for Adorno a, quote, Stichwortgeber, end quote, a giver of catchwords. Footnote, see Grigot, 2007. Zohnrettel's aspirations, which at times run parallel to Adorno's own, provide Adorno with, quote, an additional support, end quote, for forming his own understanding of the theory of value. In the years following his exchange with Sohn-Rethel, Adorno would adopt an ideology-critical approach in order to explore the mediation between the principle of identity and exchange. This can be seen in a passage in Negative Dialectics, which directly addresses the transcendental subject. Quote, as the extreme borderline case of ideology, the transcendental subject comes close to truth. The transcendental generality is no mere narcissist self-exaltation of the I, nor the hubris of an autonomy of the I. Its reality lies in the domination that prevails and perpetuates itself by means of the principle of equivalence. The process of abstraction, which philosophy transfigures and which it ascribes to the knowing subject alone, is taking place in the factual (exchange) society. End quote. Adorno. Again, in his subsequent theoretical work, Adorno is less interested in the common historical genesis of knowledge and social domination than in the factual mediation of knowledge and social domination in the here and now, while Sohn-Rethel pursues the question of how, quote, objectivity and the claim to truth of the natural sciences, end quote, are possible in the first place. Adorno can set aside this issue with a simple observation, quote, the concept of objectivity is formed in society, end quote. Adorno. In spite of Friedemann Grenz's claim to the contrary, Adorno precisely does not trace back, quote, the principle of domination, end quote, established by the intellect, quote, to the division between intellectual and manual labor, end quote. See Grenz, 1974, and Kager, 1988, in footnote. Quote, for a dialectician of Adorno's rank, causal mechanical interpretations of the relationship between commodity form of thought are simply forbidden. So there's a quote there that I didn't say. Quote, for a dialectician of Adorno's rank, causal mechanical interpretations of the relationship between commodity form and form of thought are simply forbidden. End quote. Ritzert, 1998. In the question of, quote, which comes first, the socially necessary separation of physical and mental labor, or the usurpatory privilege of the medicine man, end quote, Adorno ultimately recognizes the mere, quote, debate over the chicken and the egg. In any case, the shaman requires ideology, and without the shaman, it would not be. Without shaman, ideology would not be possible. End quote. Adorno. On this point, Adorno is even more explicit in a subsequent lecture, claiming that humans, as, quote, functionaries, end quote, of exchange processes, are already ruled by domination, and that this is why he does not base theoretical analyses on some ideal, typical, and ahistorical models of a pure exchange act from which this and that follow, end quote. Adorno. Incidentally, the passage in Negative Dialectics, which refers to Sohn-Rethel, reads as follows, quote, Alfred Sohn-Rethel was the first to point out that hidden in this principle, in the general and necessary activity of the mind, lies work of an inalienably social nature, end quote. Adorno. This reference is problematic. Sohn-Rethel would later claim in conversation never to have said, quote, what is cited here, ... In that way, that abstract labor was contained within the transcendental subject. I would never be able to justify that, end quote. Sohn-Rethel. Quoted in Hugo, 2008. This misunderstanding never came up between Adorno and Sohn-Rethel. Yet political differences did, which were at the same time also theoretical differences. These differences are manifest in two letters from 1966. Receiving Negative Dialectics from Adorno just after Negative Dialectics release, Zone Rettel thanks Adorno, quote, "Your book just arrived. Wonderful. What a Christmas gift," end quote. However, Zone Rettel then immediately takes issue with the claim in the second sentence of the introduction, quote, dot, 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 after, I'll say this is a quote within the quote, quote, after the attempt to change the world miscarried, end quote. That reads like the summary of a concluded past. Are you sure of that? For the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's annexation, I admit you're right. But even for China, I'm not so sure, and if things fail in China as well, there will be further attempts, not only among the latecomers, and I still hold the devout conviction that the world will either shatter or need to be changed by humans. For this task, quote, indefinite time, end quote, does not exist. And do negative dialectics have no relationship to changing the world? Does all that fall under the, quote, affirmative essence, end quote, from which, quote, the book seeks to free dialectics, end quote? Or is it the case that you don't view the necessary changes to the world as impossible, but rather their ability to contribute to the, quote, realization of philosophy, end quote? In that case, wouldn't the forms of thought not be determined by social being, while we would have arrived back at dialectical idealism? Without answers here, I'll hardly know how to get my bearings. Do you still remember the philosophical conversations between Walter Benjamin and yourself and Krakauer in Naples in 1924 or 1925, for which I was also present, end quote, Zone Rettel, quoted in Huga 2008. Yeah, that's the thing. If you read like the introduction to Zone Rettel's intellectual manual labor, it talks about how there's been great strivings and whatever within the People's Republic of China towards the dissolution of the distinction between intellectual and manual labor, which is very in my opinion, is like historically extremely naive. But yeah, it's definitely like a very pro-China passages in the introduction to intellectual and manual labor. Anyway, end quote, Zone Rettel. Letter from Zone Rettel to Adorno, 18th of December 1966. Adorno does, in fact, remember, quote, the Benjamin conversation you bring up. My God, how the world spirit, or whatever it's called, passed over everything. One should really try to learn from one's mistakes without betraying one's motivations. You'll believe me that I, and especially I, am not betraying my motivations, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Zone Rettel, 23rd of December 1966. Furthermore, Adorno defends himself, quote, against official Marxism's moral coercion, which consists of a particular kind of positivity, ... The notion that this must end well in all circumstances, indeed only one of the reasons, but nonetheless one of them, why it will probably be lost. I can't deny to myself that a deep injury to theory itself bears a degree of blame here. ... I can't believe there could be some hope in what is taking place in China. I'd need to disavow everything I've thought my whole life if I wanted to profess to feel anything other than dread. End quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Zone Rettel. Regarding China, Adorno is referring to the so-called Cultural Revolution. And there was like a whole, and that's like a whole thing, and unfortunately it kind of continues to this day, of like the view of like the great Chinese, the great proletarian cultural revolution in China, so-called, was like some kind of like grassroots anti-bureaucratic movement, spawned by something similar to, for instance, like I don't know, like Hungary '56 or like Germany 53 or like the Prague Spring, but that is very much not the case. But that was a very popular feeling amongst student radicals, and particularly upon people who had grown disillusioned with the Soviet Union, but but still like adhering to Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, and then or later Maoism. There's a book on here. I haven't finished it, unfortunately, which I plan on finishing it soon. But Simon Lay's book on called "The Chairman's New Clothes," which is kind of like set out to like debunk this understanding of the Cultural Revolution, and also it was published by Sham Lieb. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it was like the press that put out like the collected works of Bakunin and Orwell and like Society of the Spectacle and like I think Gilles Duvait's like the Eclipse and Reemergence of the Communist Movement. I think it might have published that as well. So like a radical left press in France. I think it published like Serge and stuff like that as well. Maybe I'm not sure. But it's like a radical press that put this out. It wasn't like a bourgeois like press. Anyway, end footnote. Concerning the, quote, realization of philosophy, end quote, which Zone-Rettel felt to be a return to idealism, Adorno responds thusly, quote, I believe the problem is posed incorrectly. It interprets Marxism totally, which is to say idealistically. There is no continuum, no identity of theory and practice. In a certain sense, practice is more modest than philosophy, and philosophy in turn doesn't assimilate into Marxism. End quote. Letter from Adorno to Zone-Rettel, 23rd of December, 1966. End footnote. This barely concealed rejection of Zone-Rettel's understanding of theory indicates his diminished influence on Adorno, who was, quote, probably only interested in Zone-Rettel's actual idea in the mid-30s, end quote. Engster, 2009. Yet this interest is attested to by the fact that, quote, a systematic usage of the apparatus of value form analysis can first be registered in the period after 36 to 37, and most clearly in the study titled On the Fetish Character in Music and the Regression of Listening, which emerged in the summer of 1938. However, this study's thesis of the substitution of use value through exchange value also shows that Adorno did not settle for a materialist version of transcendental logic, but rather pressed on in a thoroughly independent way towards a theory of negative totality. A future history of critical theory may well view this transition from a Kantian to a Hegelian problem as the decisive step by which Adorno moved beyond Horkheimer as well as Zone-Rettel. End quote. Breuer, in Zone-Rettel, Breuer, and van Grijf, 1986. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.